Watch this.
There's a movement to make changes to the U.S. Constitution, and Idaho is one of the states calling for a convention. They say it's just for simple tweaks, but some are worried it could be much more.
So I think this is especially critical in light of the other fentanyl legislation that law enforcement has pushed through the building this year.
Can one exist without the other? Mandatory minimums for having a certain amount of fentanyl because it's so dangerous. But what about a way to know if that's the drug you're dealing with? A bill allowing testing strips is moving forward. Well, there was a big step forward for downtown Boise 10 years ago today, and it only took a few decades to fill that gap on 8th and Main. There are two ways to change the U.S. Constitution. One, a two-thirds vote by both houses of Congress, which are then ratified by three-fourths of the states. The other, as granted by Article 5 of the Constitution, is for two-thirds of the state legislatures to agree to get together to propose changes to the Constitution. A convention of states, they call it, and that is what is being considered right now by members of Idaho's legislature. Convention of States Action Group says the amendments they're looking to propose would, quote, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit its power and jurisdiction, and impose term limits on its officials and members of Congress, end quote. Critics worry, though, opening up that convention could open up a lot of things to consideration, like anything. Joe Paris with us now to kind of tell us what is happening with this in Idaho right now.
Yes. So, Brian, long story short, to answer your question, it continues. It is still alive. The Senate Judiciary and Rules Committee, they have passed Senate Concurrent Resolution 112 to ask Idaho lawmakers to sign on to the application for a convention. So it takes 34 states to call the convention and 38 to ratify any amendments that are proposed. Critics say that the country is too apart politically, for the convention to happen responsibly. They worry about a runaway convention that would take on ideas outside of what Brian just mentioned. Instead, they would take up social issues like guns, abortion, LGBTQ rights. But legislative sponsor, Senator Todd Lakey, he disagrees with the assertion.
There was discussion about unity and disunity, senators. Two-thirds of the states agreeing on three topics. That's a very large degree of unity. Three-fourths of the states agreeing on a potential amendment or amendments to the Constitution. That is a very great degree of unity that would be demonstrated in our state and in our nation. The founders were very familiar with the convention process. That's why they put this into Article 5.
Since there is no language in the U.S. Constitution to limit a convention to one issue, the fear of a runaway convention is real. Which hard-fought rights and liberties are you willing to lose? There are no guidelines in the Constitution governing the process. How would delegates actually be selected? How would the American people be represented? What rules would actually apply? How would legal disputes be settled? And how would the influence of special interests be limited so the voices of the people could be heard?
Again, the idea passed the Senate committee, so now it heads to the full Senate. So, Brian, it's a very big conversation with major stakes.
Okay. All right. So we got a viewer question about what we talked about when it comes to the National or the Constitutional Convention earlier this week. Teresa asked, the Constitutional Convention, who picks the delegates? You just heard them talking about that. Which Republican Party is driving this? What powers would delegates have or assume? And she says this might be spooky.
Ooh, spooky. Yeah. So the Idaho legislature would actually be in charge of their own destiny in terms of delegates and in terms of responsibilities. And so it is unique to each individual legislature. So Idaho could select their group or their delegates however they want to do. And likely the way it would come down, it's similar to this application. It would come through some type of concurrent resolution, some type of a resolution that maybe the Senate pro tem and the Speaker of the House, they would be able to select a group or one or two people to go. Again, though, Brian, it would be up to the lawmakers here in Idaho. So let's pretend, though, they send 7. Let's say we have 7 delegates from Idaho to this convention. Idaho would only get 1 vote. Every state only gets 1 vote. So there's a lot open in the air. There was also conversation in the committee, by the way, about, well, what if we send delegates and they don't do what we like them to do? Well, Senator Lakey said, well, we could always call them back. So there's a lot of unknowns. It is interesting, though, Senator Lakey said in committee that he went to Virginia, actually, over the summer, where they had a mock, a simulation, state conventions like this. So he said it worked very well in a simulation, in a mock situation. He says that some of these ideas were unfounded when you practice it in reality, but there's a lot of conversation to be had here. Again, 15 states still need to sign on to this.
And it's never been done before, by the way. Worth
Never
pointing out,
been
but it's
done.
been talked about since early 80s. Thanks, Joe. All right, what about changes in state law, not the U.S. Constitution? Fentanyl gaining a lot of steam at the State House, as we've heard this session, mostly around creating more strict penalties, adding the drug to Idaho's mandatory minimum statute. But now there's effort to kind of loosen some restrictions. What does that mean?
So it's specifically about the drug paraphernalia statute, Brian. So how that shakes out with the Health and Welfare Committee today, well, they gave unanimous support, a green light for this bipartisan bill. So in simple terms, the state currently punishes people for having the tools to test if a drug is laced with fentanyl, or really to test a drug at all, I should say. And lawmakers today say that law is outdated.
A law is only as good as it's written.
When this bill was passed in 1980.
Previously penned a decade into the war on drugs, Idaho inked a hard line to keep its people in line.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee.
But the people say
We support this bill.
it's time for a rewrite.
Knowledge of presence or absence of a deadly substance will save Idahoans' lives.
The effort's co-sponsored by Republican Representative Marco Erickson and Democrat Ilana Rebel.
Anything that tests for drugs is banned drug paraphernalia. So we want to take fentanyl test strips off that list so that people can have ready access to them and hopefully limit the number of fentanyl overdose deaths in Idaho.
Idaho law enforcement say the drug is a crisis.
I have not seen a scarier drug trend than fentanyl.
Police overwhelmingly support a separate piece of legislation to create stronger penalties for traffickers and dealers. Throughout the session, they've had a list of reasons why.
Fentanyl is hundreds of times more lethal than heroin.
From 2019, they had 290 overdose deaths.
70% of the pills that law enforcement is finding on the street have a potentially lethal dose.
Let's defend our people, defend our land, show strength.
The statistics are serious, but pale in comparison to an anecdote.
His name was Michael Stabile.
And Caden Stone knows its weight.
He passed away from fentanyl overdose in his home at age 15. Lake City High School in Coeur d'Alene is a school of almost 2,000 students, and he stood out.
It's been nearly 3 years, and Caden's caught chasing answers.
We can't just pretend like they don't exist, because people are losing their lives.
Which is why he supports the current push to carve out fentanyl testing strips.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
A one-sided room today that says the state's written a false equivalent.
Tubes and baggies and measuring scales and needles and all of the things that you would typically associate with drug paraphernalia. But we thought that this really does not belong on that list. This is something that is most likely to be used by people trying to avoid being poisoned and overdosing on fentanyl.
The state's definition of drug paraphernalia matters because that language is in other state laws. Giving drug paraphernalia to another person is a crime. So currently, if someone has a fentanyl testing strip for whatever reason and gives it to a friend, that's a felony. It's up to a $30,000 fine and 9 years in prison just to possess it, Brian. You could be locked up for a year and fined $1,000.
Maybe I'm making a leap here, but I would think that maybe could you include Narcan in that? Because Narcan is used for drug overdoses. So if you have Narcan, are you then susceptible to having drug paraphernalia?
You're not testing with it.
Okay.
And the paraphernalia is more so like scales to weigh drugs,
Yeah.
things like that. So.
Okay. All right. It's quite a leap, I guess. Thank you very much, Andrew. The Idaho Republican Party presidential caucus. That's coming up in just about 2 weeks, on March 2nd, on a Saturday. The rules for how it will be run, well, they've been on the books and finalized since January. But this week, 2 sentences from those rules have garnered a lot of attention. From Section 9, only eligible voters and their minor children shall be admitted to the caucus. No other guests will be permitted, meaning members of the media who are not eligible as registered Republicans, they're not going to be allowed to attend and observe in the caucus in any of their 210 locations. Capital Sun first brought this up yesterday, but members of the media won't even be able to watch while they count the ballots. So the question is why? Since this wasn't how it was handled last time the GOP held a presidential caucus. All anyone has to be told by those who run the party, well, those are the rules. That's why. But it's our job as journalists to ask those questions and try to get some, well, at least try to get some of those answers. So, to get some clarification as to why this was the rule, we headed down to GOP headquarters in Boise. And we thought we might get some answers, because See that woman who appears to be on the phone in the background? That's Chairwoman Dorothy Moon.
Hi there.
But when we got inside,
Yeah.
we were told
She's headed out the door, so she's not available.
Even for just like quick 5 minutes or less than that?
Yeah, I know that Kira said they were headed out.
it was about that time we got this email from the state party rules chairman, Brent Regan, who wanted to address what he called misinformation being generated by the media about the media being shut out from the caucus. So we called him.
Regan Design, this is Brent.
Hi, Brent. This is Brian Holmes with Channel 7 in Boise, hoping he could help us understand the rules.
All right. Well, what do you need to know?
And why. Main question I have is, the media is not being allowed into the caucus this time around, but they were in 2012. If the access was allowed before, what's the reason for the change?
I don't even know that it was allowed before.
It was. In fact, on March 6, 2012, we were allowed access to multiple sites, from Ada to Canyon County, to observe and get reaction to Idaho being part of Super Tuesday for the first time.
If somebody's holding an election, you're not allowed inside the polling location where people are actually voting.
We are actually. It's something we do every election to show how the process works. But what Regan wrote at the end of his third paragraph may give us some insight. You said this is to prevent intimidation by bad actors, including members of the media.
Yeah, well, there's a fair bit of that. But I mean, the narrative that you guys are pushing that somehow this is being done in secret is complete baloney. You know, there are witnesses there. There are witnesses from the campaign. Anybody who's qualified to be in the room can watch. And the tabulation is done right out in the open in front of them.
Which, again, was how it was done in 2012.
Where each of the candidates will have a campaign rep.
The only people allowed inside are 4 staff members, an AP reporter.
Did you catch that? An AP reporter will be allowed to watch the tabulation. I think the question is like normally, again, in the past, members of the media are usually there to be able to observe the process, not how people are voting, but just the process. And that would lead to transparency.
What do you want me to say? The rules are the rules.
The rules are the rules. And this idea that this is a private ballot, a secret ballot. I mean, when you go to these caucuses, or at least back in 2012, there were people holding up signs telling you exactly who they were going to vote for. And we got video of it, and we talked to them. That, again, has changed. Then we got these responses yesterday. Melissa Davlin, who's with the Idaho Press Club, and Betsy Russell, former reporter who is part of the president of Idahoans for Openness in Government. They put out 2 statements, which are included on our website at ktvb.com, but they both question the transparency of this. Not a decision. These are rules, again, passed in January. But the question is, will they consider them or consider changing those rules? I asked Brent Regan that today, and he said, well, in order for that to happen, they'd have to call together all 255 members of the Central Committee to make that change to those rules. He doesn't think that's going to happen. Years ago today, significant progress was made in downtown Boise, filling in a hole at 8th and Main. Well, it transformed downtown Boise into what we know today. The 17-story Zions Bank building rose from the ashes almost literally, on the corner of 8th and Main. For more than 2 decades before that, though, it was an empty eyesore for the city. That corner, it was just a hole for most of that time. It was a blemish that, well, it began just after midnight, January 24th, 1987, which is why we're bringing you today into today's 208 Redial. It had stood on the corner of 8th and Main since 1905. Designed by Tortolet & Company, the same architects of the state capitol, the Overland was first built as a 4-story office building, a nod to 19th century Italian architecture, complete with terracotta cornices and clay lion heads. By 1910, another 2 levels were added, and the 6-story structure became the Eastman in 1927. Nearly 5 decades later, the city of Boise bought the building under its urban renewal plan in 1972, which is why the Eastman sat empty for another 15 years, often offering refuge to the city's homeless. It was then, in the early morning hours of January 24th, 1987, when Boise Fire Department responded to a report of smoke coming out of the building.
There was no chance of saving the building. When firefighters arrived on the scene, flames were already eating away at the building on 4 different floors. The heat was causing windows to explode, shattering glass on those below. More than 100 firefighters showed up to battle the blaze, which destroyed the Eastman building in downtown Boise.
We had an individual on the fire escape in the alley, and that fire escape came down to within about 30 feet of the ground, and we had to take a 35-foot ladder to get him off of there.
This morning, most of the flames are gone, but there's still a lot of smoke. Firemen say most of the floors inside the building have collapsed, and the fire chief is planning on ordering the dousing of the flames to stop. Otherwise, the building will turn into a big ice cube.
And by the light of the next day, the downtown landscape had changed.
The Eastman building is dangerously close to collapse. Spot fires are still flaring up here and there, but firefighters have stopped dousing the structure with fire hoses. The water is turning this building into a giant ice cube, making the rubble even more hazardous. In a heartbreaking decision, the City Council and BRA have given the fire department permission to demolish the structure. Developer Larry Leisure, who was going to renovate the building, says preserving even just the facade is now out of the question.
But I think everyone now feels that because of the very precarious nature of those 2 walls that are remaining, it would be very difficult to do so, and it's frankly right now quite dangerous.
There is one part that might be salvageable, these terracotta cornices. The clay lions' heads are very rare, and losing them would be tragic, according to historian Arthur Hart.
They have enormous dollar value as well as aesthetic and historic value. So they're certainly worth saving if we can do it without risking human life.
The Eastman building, standing here since 1905, was on the National Register of Historic Places. Once a historic landmark in Boise, it is now just a dangerous, crumbling old building. And though this is a terrible loss for Boise, BRA members insist the fire will not delay other redevelopment projects downtown.
Well, maybe it didn't, but it sure delayed that corner project. One of the 2 men who had to be rescued from the building the night of the fire ended up being charged with second-degree arson a few weeks later. Corner lot specifically became renowned for redevelopment delays. First destined to become, or to be demolished, I should say, in 1978. It wasn't, and that was supposed to make room for a downtown mall, but those plans went south, which became Bodo, which is then called the 8th Street Marketplace. Ownership of 8th and Main also changed hands several times over the years, and it became known as the Hole after one developer tried to build on it, but then stopped, left it exposed with rebar out in the open. Then finally, in 2011, the Gardner Company bought that piece of property and made it into Idaho's tallest 17-story Zions Bank building, again, which opened officially 10 years ago today.
Well, it's another soggy February evening for us. We just had some pretty strong showers move through areas towards Mountain Home, but it looks like it's drying out right now. Here's a look at the radar. You can see some of those strong showers, and if we get a little bit closer, you'll see that they just cleared I-84 in some spots, but still a little bit stronger over I-84 towards Mountain Home right now. So rain's coming down there, lightening up in other areas, but we are expecting another round of moisture. But you can see a lot of the clouds and the snow sticking with us as the sun sets. Those temperatures were on the more mild side today, up in the 50s for several Treasure Valley spots, towards the 50-degree mark in Magic Valley, and in the 30s in mountain locations. And so I know we're going to see consistent rounds of moisture, but I just want to point out some time frames. The current one we're looking at is looking to linger until around 8 o'clock tonight, and then we have an additional round that will be happening in the overnight hours, and then we get a bit of a break and we'll be mainly dry until Saturday night. So here's what that looks like with our model data. You can see there's that clearing that I mentioned around mid-morning tomorrow, tapering off from north to south, and then we see that additional round coming in on Saturday night, late Saturday night, and it does look to be snow for valley locations, so we'll continue to track that. But precipitation staying well into your 7-day forecast.
All right, you thought holidays were over after yesterday, at least for a while. Well, it's not. Today is February 15th, which is National Singles Day, I guess, because that's what PennStakes.com tells us. It's a betting site lending a hand into the world of weird polls. But after we looked into this fact, I guess, may not be as true as they might think. Well, according to PennStakes.com, a betting website out of, you guessed it, Pennsylvania, National Singles Day lands on February 15th, the day after the day dedicated to couples. But what do you want to bet that's not true? Because a quick Google search says Singles Day is actually Saturday, September 21st, where they point out National Singles Day takes place on the Saturday of Singles Week in September. Wait, there's a whole week celebrating American singles? Folks, not cheese food. Meanwhile, in China, National Singles Day is on November 11th. 11/11. Get it? Because that's 4 singles in a row. All right, back to the 208 and PennStakes.com. They claim Idaho as the second least single state in America, thanks to the 55% of us that are married and only 9.5% of us that get divorced. Number one, that'd be the state to our south, which makes sense. Or does it? Because according to census numbers, Idaho actually had the highest divorce rate in 2021 at 11.1 per 1,000 women, putting us neck and neck with Arkansas, which tracks with our tendency to be taken advantage of in romance scams. 98 of us lost $4.3 million to pretend romances. But who can blame us? We're also the 5th most romantic state according to Bookies.com, another betting site, right behind Utah, again. North Dakota? Wait, they're the most romantic? And the least romantic? Sorry, Oregonians, you're just too ordinary. Worth pointing out, betting's still illegal in Idaho, but apparently sending out these websites with these lists, that's not. That's still allowed. And as long as you keep doing that, I know we're biting on the bait. We'll just keep making fun of them. All right, a couple of questions to wrap up the show today about the Republican presidential caucus coming up in 2 weeks. This one from Sage in Boise. It seems like Republican caucus is everything except transparent. Are they going to let you vote for anyone other than Trump? Yes, there are actually 6 candidates on the ballot, even though 3 are only still in the race. That'd be Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, and Ryan Binkley. The other 3 have dropped out, but they are still on the ballot if you'd like to vote for them. It seems like the rule would make sense, this keeping only members that are registered voters and their kids to allowed inside. If any Republicans were members of the media, it could get covered. That's true. If you are a Republican member of the media, you can go in. You want to take part in that caucus, you can. Whether or not you can take your phone out and start shooting video, that's up to the precinct captain, I guess, whoever's running the caucus at that point. So did they manage to save the Lions heads on the old Eastman building, asked Barbara. Yes, they did. One of them's inside the Zions Bank building. Just one, though. The rest were destroyed. We'll see you tomorrow.